Hello.
It only works if you hold it.
Mine works. Yeah.
Good evening. This is the March 25th meeting of the Newcastle Planning Commission. We'll call the meeting to order. I'm Charlie Gadzik, the chair. Will you all join me in a flag salute? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We're having a little trouble with our microphones at the dais this evening. The one that I'm using works properly, but the other ones need to have someone hold their thumb on the microphone to keep it working. So if the audio goes out for those of you who are watching remotely, that's the reason, and we'll try to be conscious of it here so that we don't let that happen. We'll begin with roll call.
Sorry, Commissioner Kack.
Here?
Commissioner Lowe?
Here.
Commissioner Beeson?
Here.
Commissioner Blocker?
Here.
Vice Chair Troutman?
Here.
Chair Gatzek?
Sorry, they were just calling.
Here.
All here.
Okay. You have the agenda before you. Does anybody have any changes to the agenda? None indicated, so we'll consider that approved. That takes us to the minutes. We'll start with the minutes of our January 28th meeting. Has anybody noticed any corrections or changes to the minutes of the January 28th meeting? Okay, saying none, we'll consider those approved and move to the minutes of the February 25th meeting. Any changes there? Okay, we'll consider those approved as well. That brings us to the public comment period. Would anyone in the audience wish to comment? Okay, nobody is stepping forward to the podium, so we will close the public comment period and move to commissioner comments. And why don't we go from right to left this evening? Commissioner Kack, would you like to comment on anything?
I don't have anything to comment on except that I'm just enjoying this glorious sunny day. The first day, feels like first day of spring, so I bet all the residents of Newcastle are as well, so I'm glad to be here.
Vice Chair?
Hey guys, as usual, it's good to be here with you and our sterling staff. And welcome to Council Member Frost Blakely, I'm sorry. Good to see you. I've spent many an evening in that chair, being the only one in the room, so you'll get used to it.
Commissioner Beeson?
I have nothing to add except for it's beautiful to see this lovely view that we're looking at with some sunshine. So I look forward to many more months of that. Oh, it's working.
Commissioner Lowe?
I don't have anything to add and glad to be here. Thank you.
And finally, Commissioner Stu.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
Commissioner Blocker, excuse me. All right, I have no comments, nor do I have well, I guess I do have just a brief report. The applications are still being accepted for our vacancy. I think the closure date is 31st, Tuesday, I believe that is. So I don't know if we'll have somebody by our April meeting. We hope to, but that's the status of that. If you know anybody who wants to apply, there's still opportunity to do so. And we'll move to the report of the director.
Evening, everybody. So just a couple of updates here. First is that we've started talking about the downtown plan a bit. Commissioner Beeson, Vice Chair, I was going to say Vice Chair Len, I'm sorry, Vice Chair Troutman, and of course Chair Gadzik, Tyler Coyle and myself have met a couple times just to sort of start brainstorming. And we've also spoken, or the council, the mayor has expressed some interest in this as well. And of course, this is part of our comprehensive plan, is to utilize our downtown better. So just to keep you informed, we're working with the mayor and city manager on potentially putting together an advisory committee. Those next steps are still to be determined, and hopefully I'll have some more updates for you next month. And of course, before any plan were to go forward, we would of course come to the Planning Commission as a whole. Also, just for the sign code, we're going to have the sign code hearing and the nonconformance hearing next month. Unfortunately, those notices did not get in the paper on time, which is why we're not having that this month, but next month we will. And for the sign code, something that you'll notice is that staff are suggesting that we don't try to regulate temporary signs on private properties. Right now, that's sort of how it's written. It's very vague. But it's very hard for us to do. We can't do sign sweeps, obviously, on private property. So we'll keep it in the right of way and areas that we can control, of course, but for those areas we can't control, we'll just leave it to the property owners. Anyway, any questions or thought on that, please feel free to let Tyler or myself know. And it sounds like also Tyler has gotten the microphones fixed with Jane, so. That's it for me.
Well, let's proceed to the general business. There are no public hearings tonight. We've got two items, both of which will be handled largely by Associate Planner Coyle. We'll begin with an introduction to small cells. You have the floor, Tyler.
Thanks, Chair Gatzek. All right, so I'm just going to really briefly here talk about small cell wireless facilities. So what is a small cell wireless facility? You've probably seen them around, although you may not have recognized them as such. You have your traditional idea of a wireless facility either on a large pole, or maybe it's an array of panel antennas up on a building. And that is still the backbone of the network, but that network has since expanded into these much smaller pieces of equipment that can be placed relatively innocuously on power poles, on light poles, on all sorts of things, really. They're only a couple feet long, and they may connect to the antenna, and then they may connect to a box nearby that is itself only, a couple feet by a couple feet in size. So they're much smaller, much more innocuous in the public, and their role is almost like a network boost. So you have your large cells or your traditional facilities can send signal out pretty powerfully over a large area, but there are sometimes holes that come in that the coverage of that network, either through hills or buildings or what have you, or there may be places where there's just a high concentration of use in the network where it gets overwhelmed. And in that case, you can now use the small cell apparatus to essentially fill in that gap. They don't cover nearly as much range as a traditional cell tower would, but they are cheaper to install and they have quality signal while you are in their coverage. So they're a really nice thing to do to augment networks. They can fill in gaps, or they can take that spot that's really crowded and make sure it doesn't get overwhelmed when a predictable crowd comes in. So you're looking at, when I say small area, like 1/10 to 2 kilometer coverage radius. And then they tend to be small enough that they can go on utility poles and other structures. I've pulled an example of one here that has the antenna at the top, and then there's a box down below that kind of helps with the processing of information. And that's really all that there is to a small cell facility. There was a burst of installations a couple of years ago for these, and work has since slowed, in part because of just the commercial landscape, and in part because of the immense scale of the number of installations you need to do of these, that the regulatory network may not change that much city to city, but when you have to be installing them by the thousands in all of these jurisdictions, even the smallest catches can make them make you think twice about just blanket covering. So you see them, they tend to concentrate more in these high demand areas or in areas with like kind of known thorny coverage holes. There has been some work recently to maybe make a bit of a middle ground technology that would still meet the size requirements of small cells, that, but it would have a little bit broader coverage area. Still not nearly what a traditional cell tower would get you, but more. And if that were to commercialize, you'd probably see another burst of these. And you think of some of the places in Newcastle where we just more or less have coverage holes because of the hills and what have you, that seems like it would be a good fit, although I am not an expert in this kind of technology. So how do we regulate these today? The short answer is poorly. We have a wireless communications facilities code that was built or last updated in 2013 when small cell technology was not yet commercialized. And so that code doesn't really envision small cells. They do meet the definition of a wireless communication facility, and so they are regulated, but that code is built with the idea that, that code thinks that it's regulating a large installation that's going to have noise and visual impacts that are well beyond what a small cell device would have. And so the requirements just don't necessarily fit the realities of that new technology very well. And so in 2023, actually, we first began working with Daniel Kenny of Ogden Murphy Wallace, a law firm, to draft a new chapter of our code that would be specific to regulating small cells. And as we got closer to the comprehensive plan and we had some leadership turnover, it just kind of had to go on the back burner for a while. And now that we're past some of that, we're looking to bring it back, finish out the draft, and then maybe account for any new technological changes that have happened since 2023 and put it in place. We've actually been able to reconnect with Daniel Kenny in particular, so this is going to be same person picking up right where they left off. So we think it's going to be a relatively smooth process, knock on wood. So some of the future considerations in that code, we think we're going to create a new chapter in that municipal code. We'll have a clear line between the macro and the small cell technologies. And then we'll need, dimensional and noise standards for that technology. A standard franchise agreement becomes more important when you're installing these things in bulk. And then incorporating federal rules into the code, of course, and future-proofing to the extent that we can. We can't just go imagining everything, but if there's something that looks like it's right on the door and it seems realistically possible, our code should be able to handle it. And so that is really where we're at right now. It is square one. Lucky for us, we had something of a draft code before that we can pick up and start working on again. But because we don't really have a workable draft at this point, so I don't want to get into any specifics today. But that is just sort of an introduction to the technology and where we may go from here.
Questions for Tyler? Commissioner Keck?
One quick question. So you said you're still in the preliminary stage. So what's the timeline looking like? Like, when do we find out where the placement of these small cell towers is going to be? Is it a year out or?
So as far as the actual placement of the small cell towers, that's not something that we'll decide in like a granular detail in the code. It'll be, the code is going to make rules where, like, if a provider wants to go on a power pole in the city right of way, what are the rules? What's the franchise agreement? If a if a cell provider wants to work with a private individual's land, what are their regulations? What's the regulatory landscape? But we won't be saying here, and here are where all of these things will go. We'll leave it up to the providers themselves to come to us and make their own determinations for where exactly things go. And I would expect to move on this code relatively quickly, probably have something more solid for you within the next 1 or 2 meetings.
Since these small cell towers, we're just going to call them that for, each provider installs their own. So when we're looking at that code, are we going to say that there's a maximum of this many providers within a particular region so that we don't end up with like a concentration of 4 all trying to be on the same light pole, or how are we going to manage that process?
So that is something that the code is going to need to address. It is, how much we can limit it, I think, will be bounded by FCC rules. But that, it's very useful to have a lawyer who lives in small cell wireless for those kinds of questions. But that is something our code's going to have to address. And I don't have the specifics for you yet, but it is going to be something we're mindful of.
So just to be clear, so basically, because I have a lot of dead zones around my area as well, so I like this. Do we need to go to our carrier then and let them know, the provider, cell phone provider, and tell them that, hey, this is something that we need, and then they come in and they install in particular locations?
I would expect that in most cases, the providers have an idea of where their weak spots are, and they will move on their own to fill them. But for a technology like this, maybe they would be receptive. I don't know. I think it would really be on a carrier by carrier basis, and it's not something that the city can really influence what they decide. I'm not sure how optimistic I would be that you come with them with a specific location, that they're going to be able to work on that specific location, but I don't work for those companies.
Is there an opportunity for the city to earn any revenue from giving an operator a place on a city power pole, or city light pole rather?
So I would imagine that a franchise agreement would come with some revenue, but I don't know the specifics. I wouldn't expect it to be lucrative, certainly. I would expect it to be either neutral or mildly positive.
What's the connection between small cells and 5G? Are they, I seem to remember that small cells was the way to 5G, but does that correspond to what
I
your
think-
understanding is?
I think the technology, the technology evolved on that a little bit. So one of the things with 5G, and this is not my field of strength here, but from what I know, I think one of the big assets of 5G was the really low latency, those really fast responses to pings. And if you're going from a cell tower that's really far away, that does fundamentally caps how fast you can have those responses. And so the 5G, these small cell towers can be helpful with that. But I think that their ability to get the 5G signal out over a larger distance did end up maybe being a little bit more effective than they'd initially expected. And so the backbone of the network can remain those traditional, maybe an evolved form of those traditional setups, with the small cells filling in the gaps, meeting those high traffic areas, and with all of them moving in a whole spectrum of coverage that actually ends at your Wi-Fi router. I would view them as part of a whole system and not one replaces the other for 5G. They're all useful.
I have a question is, I think the small cell is kind of need to get the signal from the macro tower. Does that mean basically the provider need to be already providing, have a cell tower in the area? Meaning I think in my area basically is Xfinity. There's no, T-Mobile, their wireless couldn't really provide. They don't have the cell, they don't have the, reach here. Question really is, when we say it's provider by provider, but is it actually, there is a pre-request. It's not everybody can get in. You need to already have a technology capacity here.
So, and I don't want to get too into the specifics here because that becomes more of a technical question that I'm not well equipped to answer, but these things they all operate as part of a common network. And I believe what happens is essentially your smaller systems feed data into your larger systems. Almost, you could think of them like the branches in the trunk of a tree. And
It's like a booster.
yeah. And so if there is no trunk anywhere nearby, you may not be able to go straight to a small cell and have that be it. Now, where is the distance? Because we all know that T-Mobile has poles in the region. And so does it need to be that you're in reception distance on some way of that pole? Does it need to be you're just outside of it? Does it need to be you're 3 miles away? That's what I don't know, and that's why I can't really confidently answer it.
Not to be left out, I'll ask a question. Do we presently have any of these in the city? And/or do we presently have any requests for permits to place any of these?
Not that I know of as far as what exists now. I know that in the past there had been some requests and maybe an application to put them in, but I don't know that they went anywhere. And in part, it is that our code is a major barrier as it's written now to the speed and just the practical realities and needs of this kind of technology. So you would see them in other cities though. Like I think if you went to downtown Bellevue and you walked 3 blocks, you might see them in 5 places. I think starting with any high traffic area, these things are really useful. And then I know that they can also feed in gaps, but finding one of those in the wild may be a little harder to do on your own.
Any other questions on small cells? Okay, why don't we move on to the next order of business, the downtown plan.
All right, so this one is going to be a bit more involved than the small cells.
Eileen, sorry to interrupt. Could you wake up
Oh.
the TV?
Why is it not?
Is everybody's monitor working? Yeah. Oh. There we go. Thank you.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about our downtown standards. The downtown that you see today has quite a lot actually kind of underneath the surface. There's more history there and more detail than one might imagine at first glance. And so I just want to, we're maybe talking about updates to the downtown standards writ large over, the next while. And so the idea here tonight would be to just kind of level set for what is the situation in downtown today, what are the planning documents that govern downtown today, and what are their goals, how do they relate to each other? Essentially, how did we get here? This presentation is not going to be about any recommendations to take action right now. It's going to be more of an introduction so that everybody knows where are we starting from, so that in the future when we start looking to make these updates, everyone at least knows just what we are updating from and maybe where some of the strengths and weaknesses of our current frameworks are. And I say frameworks with an S because there are two plans that affect downtown, one to a greater degree than the other. You have the 2017 Downtown Strategic Plan, which is the more recent, and then you have the 2000 CBC Plan. And the 2017 plan partially replaced the CBC plan, but the CBC plan is actually still in force and referenced in our code. So we should talk about them both and kind of how they do or don't relate to each other. But just a really quick introduction, we have a walkable mixed-use code, or a code that tries to go for a walkable mixed-use feel in our downtown area today. You have zoning standards and the downtown transition, which is mostly these areas to the west and southwest near the border of downtown, and then the downtown core, which is going to be like your Safeway and QFC areas and the commercial and industrial uses behind the QFC. Right, so we've got the zoning standards, and then there's also a design guidelines overlay and a separate chapter of the municipal code. And so the first one of these plans was CBC Corridor Plan. In 1997, Newcastle is a new city. We've just passed a comprehensive plan. It calls for trying to enliven and invigorate downtown Newcastle, but in a larger conception than we may have today. This was thinking about the area between Lake Bourne all the way up through what is today the Newcastle Commons. And those were viewed as three separate but very much related areas. You have, there was a lot of economic growth happening at the time, and between that and the comp plan, there was an opportunity to turn that downtown into a walkable mixed-use center. And so the CBC, or Community Business Center Plan, creates three sectors, two of which I'm not going to linger on too much. One, Coal Creek, which is today's Newcastle Commons. that really directly informed what the area looks like today. That master plan was done very much with this plan in mind. Then there's Lake Boren, which was mostly environmental improvements and the Lake Boren Loop Trail. It also has heavily informed what Lake Boren looks like today. And then you had downtown, which was a vision for reorienting and redeveloping downtown and really connecting those other two sectors. So within downtown in 1997, you've got strong retail demand. There's housing growth in the area, single family and multifamily coming in, and so there was. And from the comp plan, they found that there was an appetite for more amenities down there and sort of a quote Main Street feel, and so starting from that, those kind of like raw materials and situation. The city worked with Bakers, a pretty prominent design and planning firm in the area, to develop a plan for downtown, and they sure did that. So they knew that Coal Creek Parkway is a major divider of downtown. That it's if you're going to have a pedestrian-oriented downtown, the width and the speed of the traffic on Coal Creek is difficult, and so they had a very creative solution to that. They proposed a pedestrian bridge to go over Coal Creek Parkway. Now, the thing with pedestrian bridges is it's well known that they have some urban design drawbacks typically, which is you get over the street fine, and then you have ramps or stairs or what have you on the sides, and they tend to be so long and convoluted to get up and down that people often just end up crossing the street without bothering with the bridge. So the planners here were aware of that, and they had a solution, which was to, on either side of that pedestrian bridge, on either side of Coal Creek, to build possibly below grade, but definitely at least 1 story tall of parking garage to raise the ground level de facto up to the bottom of the bridge. And then they would build retail over the top of the parking garage, thus kind of defeating the Coal Creek issue. And this pedestrian path that would be created would form an east-west pedestrian main street that is anchored by the bridge that would run from essentially where Safeway is today, right through where QFC is, and back to 132nd. And that would intersect with a north-south path that would be an alley, sort of an alley for cars and a pathway for people to use, most prominently featuring pedestrians. Today, that's called the Wunderf. It's actually pretty, very forward-thinking for a 2000s plan to have something like this in it. They also called for a transit center on Coal Creek Parkway, not a walk and ride, or not a park and ride, but a walk-up center for future residents of the area primarily. And they wanted civic buildings to be located downtown. So I've just said a lot of things, but the main takeaway here is that you had a multi-part plan, and every major aspect of the plan amplifies every other aspect. So what we have here on the left is the original CBC plan, and it's all of its figure ground glory. And so you starting from up in the lake, and then through downtown, and then Newcastle Commons. You may look at this and see like this looks a lot like Newcastle Commons. There is a reason for that. But I want to really zoom in more on the downtown portion itself. And so you can see this bridge going through the middle of everything here. This here is the QFC. And then this on the right here is where the Safeway is. I think they were imagining a mixed use structure here. And so you have some parking on the sides, but a lot of like mid-rise infill type development. And then you have your esplanade that goes over Coal Creek and links into this north-south pathway that they called the Central Alley. And then you would have, this was zoned industrial at the time, but this is like where, the trucking business is and those kind of like semi-commercial industrial type buildings are. They envision redeveloping those as, mixed use or multifamily mid-rise structures. And then 132nd would be the connecting street between the Coal Creek sector and the downtown. And so everything on this plan builds into everything else. So you have the pedestrian esplanade and the pedestrian esplanade gets across Coal Creek Parkway. The parking garages on the sides of the esplanade make the bridge useful to real people. The the transit center, or those two things, and the transit center differentiate downtown from other developments in the area, and it becomes a signal to build more multifamily housing. Multifamily housing goes in, there's now more demand for additional shops and things, and then the whole thing sort of is supposed to create a positive feedback loop. And you put the Civic Center and any other public building you can in this area to get daytime traffic in without offices. And so the whole thing is, everything links to everything else. And if you can get the significant investments needed to get it off the ground, it does have some potential and there's a logic to it. But we should note that this is not cheap to get over the road. And they did propose just a crosswalk essentially to start, like a signalized intersection. But the goal here was to get those parking garages in place and the pedestrian bridge. And that is a significant lift, especially when that's the first thing that you're doing. And the flip side to everything building on everything else is that you kind of need these pieces to come together to get ignition. And so when you don't have that bridge necessarily, and you don't have that transit center, which the city ultimately opted not to do, you don't get that ignition. And we'll come back to that.
Let me add to that, it takes more than just the city wanting to have ignition. You have to have all those landowners that either do it voluntarily or the city has to find a way to eject them from those properties. So it's.
Yes, that's an excellent point. There's a big difference between in what was then called the Coal Creek sector, the Mutual Materials site, which was one big piece of land. We had one plan for how to develop it, and then you could get one master developer who has the juice to build the whole thing. And whether they phase it or not is up to them, but they have control from the get-go. And that makes developing the commons in some ways a simpler thing to do when you're just in today's development, in today's development world, where there are large pots of money out to do single projects that can be advanced. In some ways, it's simpler to do that than to assemble and make lots of different property owners coordinate, which the downtown section of the plan really relied on. And so you could see here, this is the pedestrian, the Newcastle Esplanade itself. So this is Coal Creek over here on the right. And then on the left is actually, when you have the intersection to go into the Safeway off Newcastle Way, they imagined that being another street that went north-south, and then this bridge would go over that street as well. So we're actually looking at two bridges. And it looks, it looks great. I mean, we can see the design, we can see how, you can see how that if you had this one thing in place, then the other things might follow. But but we're leading with a pretty big if. And then for the zoning, a lot of the zones that they recommended staying with were there already to be. We've lost it again.
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to do it without interrupting.
Let's just. Okay. Were there already to begin with. So you look, this map is largely not the map that we have today. This CB, R18, O24, later to be infamous O24, R48, those are not zones that we use today. This MU to MC, this was for the commons, and we still do have that today. But this code mostly wanted to retrofit the existing zones. So like they proposed a bunch of text amendments to the community business zone that would change it from a traditional Euclidean like strip center oriented zoning to something that could tolerate mixed use development and building up near to the street. It was probably not to the level that we would write some of these standards today, but this was also 2000 and the thinking on it was just not quite to where we are now. And yeah, so your 2 to 5 stories is continuously stated in the plan, with 2 stories being more for the retail and businesses and 5 stories for the apartments. The later code settled on 65 feet in height in many of these zones. Height setbacks and lot coverage were designed to allow the buildings to be close together, and they didn't do a lot of direct regulation of bulk. So FAR was not really floor area ratio, which maybe I don't want to get into it right this second, is not the main means that they wanted to regulate with. So the whole point from this plan was how do the buildings set on the ground, how do they relate to each other, and not so much how much building is there. And they also introduced some new design guidelines that when they first went in were very much about like just how do we get this thing off the ground. They were relatively simple and they applied more towards building out the core infrastructure pieces you needed, not so much like they're more rudimentary than the design guidelines we have now. So the outcomes for that plan, I mean, the Coal Creek and Lake Bourne sectors were largely successful. I mean, to the point where the last housekeeping came around, we removed the Coal Creek section from our design guidelines because it was effectively finished. We were sunsetting it. So the city chose not to build the transit center in 2005. Apparently they did have some money for that and it didn't end up happening. But they did upgrade some of the bus stops, Route 240 on Newcastle Way, which by the way is about to get a frequency upgrade with the Cross Lake opening on the 28th. It's going to be a 15-minute bus now. The bridge and the parking garages were not constructed. I think you would have needed a large source of external money to come in because getting everything coordinated between the property owners and finding a developer who was willing to front that was maybe unrealistic at the time, and just a major challenge to do. The City Hall, the library, and the Valley Medical Center were all in keeping with the spirit of the plan. It's not exactly where it said to put them, but they did all end up in the downtown area, and they actually make for a nice walkable block here. So I think you could say the CBC plan had something to do with that. And we did have one multifamily building constructed while this plan was the main plan in force.
If I might add, the City Hall, the city didn't decide to put the City Hall here. The building was here and the city had an opportunity. The city was renting a space in here. It had the opportunity to buy it, and that's why the City Hall is here as opposed to a planning decision to locate a City Hall here. And even that decision was quite controversial. There was a lot of opposition to the city owning this building at the time.
Oh, interesting. So thanks for that. There was an update to the design standards in 2008. The city just updated them to make them more interpretable to, projects going in, make them, remove conflicts with zoning, but they kept the spirit and goals of the original. And so this update is not the most important when you're thinking about downtown today. This is a good time to talk about design guidelines in general a little bit. because they're quite, it's a complicated topic to the extent that we could spend the whole time talking about the various guidelines, and that would not be a good use of our time, I don't think. But the way that buildings relate to the street, the way that they look and feel, there's lots of different aspects to this, and the design guidelines try to capture the most important aspects, or in some cases, every aspect they can think of, and they suggest regulations, but they're a little bit different in many cases from like true zoning standards that are enforceable to the letter. They tend to be more, we're going to tell you what we want this to be in maybe a thematic way, and then someone proposes a building that they think meets the spirit of those guidelines, and then there's fundamentally a bit of a judgment call on whether that was successful or not. And it can, Newcastle doesn't have any design commissions, but in other jurisdictions, that's been made for a laborious and ever-looping process. But I guess the important thing to know here is that we have these design guidelines that sit separate from the zoning standards. They're in the municipal code. They're in what's called an overlay, which is you have a set area where these extra regulations apply to, separate from your typical zoning standards. And they're more clear and objective than they used to be, but it's fundamentally difficult to get them down, or to have those design standards down to a science, or at least our code doesn't quite get there. So some of the things that may be regulated by design guidelines might be like building articulation. So you think of like an old school apartment building, and it's a brick made out of bricks. And then you think of a newer apartment building that has all of these like kind of notches cut into it, or maybe the paint or the materials change every like 40 feet as you go down. Maybe you have parts that like jut closer to the street and then parts that come further back. All of those sorts of things are what's called articulation. And they're meant to stop the buildings from looking like one huge block, essentially. And when you have larger buildings, it can be an issue that they can get pretty oppressive. And so it's good to have some kind of regulation of articulation, but you can overdo it. So that's just one example of a thing that our code regulates. Another one is like when you're walking on the building, when you're walking along the sidewalk, how do windows come all the way down to the sidewalk level? Or are blank walls allowed? How, when you have a retail space, how tall is how tall is the doors of fenestration? I think ours is 15 feet or more. And when you have pedestrian pathways coming in from a parking lot, how wide do those need to be? How are they planted? What's the lighting look like on them? The design guidelines cover all of that and more. So they're really quite, there's quite a lot to them. So in 2017, there were concerns about the scale of new development from citizens in, within a few miles of downtown. And that caused the city to adopt a new framework for downtown and to update the vision. So some of the things that came out of that, it was very public feedback forward. And some of the things that came out of those working sessions were that the idea that Newcastle should be a bedroom community first, and that its downtown should be local serving over regional serving. So beyond just some of these things about the land use, there was, this is a reimagining, so we're also thinking about the transportation and how people are going to move through this downtown. So they proposed a street and signal to cross Coal Creek at the north end of the Safeway and QFC parcels to connect up through that to 132nd Place. And I have a picture coming on that, I promise. And core areas can hold additional height, but height should be reduced in general and bulk restrictions should be added. So we need to take, they made the buildings shorter across the board and just to varying degrees. And then they also added bulk restrictions, which I'll get into a little bit more later. So
Tyler, let me add something here too. I would characterize the 2017 plan, so I was on the commission then, and so was Councilmember Frost Bleakley. And I would say it was just a reaction to an uproar over the creation of the building next door, which was much higher than anybody realized could be built there. It was a surprise to the city staff, I think, that the plan allowed a building that high to be built there. And the neighborhood behind there was in an uproar because now there were people looking down on their backyards. And it was a very hot, one of the hottest political issues that Newcastle has encountered over the past 10 years. So the 2017 plan was an effort to step back and have a check into what the community now really wanted. So there's a lot of sensing to find out what the community wanted for the downtown. And at the same time, an effort not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because that 2000 plan still looked pretty nice. I mean, it's a dreamy plan, you know, if it ever could be done, it's a dreamy plan. We didn't want that to go away, but there had to be something that was a practical reaction that told the residents that, yes, the city hears you. And so the heights were scaled down by about a story everywhere. And then there were these transition zones that Tyler referred to, so that you didn't have a monstrous building, a wall looking down on a community. So that was the political background of that plan. But it was great too, because there really was a very extensive community outreach effort to find out what people wanted, and people still wanted a mixed use downtown.
yeah, you could really see that when you look through the plan. It's very, very heavy on public feedback and forward, literally, in the sense that you have to go through the public feedback before you get to the plan. And I think that they structured it that way intentionally. The number of outreach sessions, the ways that they did that outreach were all very intensive. And I think everything flowed backwards from what they found there. So we'll start with I guess there were a lot of physical improvements. Much like the first plan had physical improvements, this one had its own proposed as well. And you can see where we have some of the same issues that we're grappling with. Coal Creek is difficult to get across. 132nd is a good opportunity to connect to what they now knew, or then knew, was going to be the Commons. There needs to be an east-west crossing somewhere through where the QFC, or the general area where the QFC is today. And so you see the same issues are recognized, and then they have differing solutions. So that Coal Creek crossing in the original plan would have been in the middle here. And in this one, they've moved it further up to the north to align with a private street that's already there that could be upgraded to a full local access street in time with a signal to cross Coal Creek Parkway. 132nd Place, Green Street. This is almost a complete preservation of the idea from the original plan, that we want 132nd Place to be green, welcoming, a nice place to walk that helps to naturally draw people up and down between the Commons and downtown. That desire has really been a through line between every document I've seen. They wanted a Ray Street intersection at Newcastle Way and 132nd. That's a traffic calming thing that helps it slows drivers down very slightly, but more what it lets them do is when you go up a little bit, it gets your attention, and it reminds when that intersection is on the elevation of the crosswalk, it's a reminder to the driver that they're in a shared space right now. They're not just in the road. And so it's kind of it's a natural combination between a speed bump and it's just like a mental cue to like look around. And so they proposed one there, and then I think they also had another one that they were hoping for at Newcastle Way and Coal Creek. And then along Coal Creek, they wanted to do a lot of these kind of streetscape improvements. So we have kind of a planting median, I assume this is planted median in the middle there, and then sidewalk and landscaping upgrades along the side of the street. And all of that is to make Coal Creek just a little bit more manageable to deal with. It doesn't necessarily slow the street at all, but it takes some of the areas like these planter strips were turn lanes that were useless before because there was nothing to turn into. And so it just tempers the street a little bit, makes it a little bit more humane. And while it doesn't have the drama of a bridge, it's pretty doable to do something like this. And it has been done in many contexts. Let's see, 7 connections to downtown, filling in the sidewalks and that sort of thing. It was a city-wide strategy. And then gateway signage, which I was actually came up just an hour or so ago for me. This was the idea to have a dramatic monument when you come into the city. That they had a short list of designs under consideration, but think big, bold, bright, like just an attention grabber. And then on the regulatory side, they simplified those zoning districts down really significantly. So you had R24, which was there all along, left alone. And then the areas where most of that redevelopment could potentially happen got switched to downtown core in the middle here, and then downtown transition, where we are sitting right now. And as Charlie mentioned, that downtown transition is supposed to be that kind of like gentle falling back in towards the single family areas. There's a planning concept called the transect that I really mostly should not get into right now, but involves a gradual organic transition between very intense and rural areas with everything in between. And so you can kind of see that concept coming into play here. And both of these would be mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented districts. And the main difference between them would just be how much of an emphasis is there on commercial and what's the scale, with the scale being a bit higher in the core and a bit lower in the periphery. So the development standards that came out of this plan and are here today are fairly short. So you have a base height of 25 feet, essentially 2 stories in downtown transition and 3 stories in the downtown core, that can raise up to 4 stories in the downtown transition or 5 in the downtown core. There's an exception for the downtown core height that lets you get up to 65 feet on corners if you make an equivalent trade of public space with the city. For the most part, though, the height limit is 55 feet. You have a floor area ratio minimum of 1:1 and a max of 2.5 to 1. So now just a quick primer on floor area ratio, or FAR. It's a way to directly regulate bulk, aside from saying, but it's neutral on where that bulk goes or how it's distributed. So imagine you have a piece of land, and an FAR of 1 means that you can put a 1-story building on all of that land, from tip to tail. Or you could build 2 stories on that piece of land if you only cover exactly half of it. And 3 stories turns you into exactly 1/3 of it, and so on and so forth. And so it's not a direct regulator of height, but it is a regulator of bulk and the total square footage you can it can be used in better and worse ways. But without getting into that too much, the maximum is 2.5 to 1. So imagine you could build, if you were allowed to build 100% of your land out, which you're not, you could build up to 2 stories and then a 3rd story that covered half of the square footage of the lot. That FAR would realistically, because you have to exclude some land for open space and sidewalks and access, maybe that would work out to that 35 to 55 feet. Maybe not, depending on the circumstances. It's no guarantee that the FAR would match your height necessarily. We also have ground floor retail requirements that are scaled to the size of the nearest street. This plan, much like the last one, envisioned building out something of a grid downtown to make it more accessible to pedestrians. When you're dealing with an area as a pedestrian, the more routes you have around and through the buildings, your ability to get around the whole area expands really rapidly. And conversely, when you lose that ability and you only have 1 or 2 places to get around, your ability to move on foot drops to almost nothing really fast. And so they have type 1, 2, and 3 streets, and essentially in a type 1 street, you'd have to give almost all of your ground floor space to commercial uses that are active. So they have to, the public has to be able to engage with them in some way, whether that's to buy something or do a service. The public has to be able to go into that space for some reason. And then type 2, I think it's like 70% of the facade has to have the commercial use on it. And then type 3, I think it's 50%. So some of the design standards from the design guidelines were also brought into the zoning code, which it's, in some ways that can be a good thing if it turns hazy standards into very clear, followable standards. But it can also just create something of a confusion and duplication between your design standards if you have them in both places. So some of those things with the street front building standards, the pedestrian ways and circulation standards, on-site open space requirements are good things to regulate. And I actually think some of the things with like the street front building standards in this plan are really good. We would spend too much time getting into them, but they do a good job of making active street fronts a default outcome. It brought a lot of those into the zoning where whatever you do have there is like very strictly and literally enforceable in a way the design guidelines are.
I think part of the street front building standards that it's important to understand is that anything new that has to be built under this plan has to front the street. You can't have a parking lot on the street. So that means that anything that we have there now has to be totally redone in order to conform to this plan. You can't just do modifications of the existing buildings. It's got to all move to the street.
Yes. So right now you can do renovations to the extent that they're for upkeep, essentially. But if you're going to, or the value of your work is worth more than 50% of the value of your structure, then you need to come up to code, which is to say you need to fundamentally reimagine that site. And that can be a powerful force for trying to move things in the right direction. It's just, powerful forces have their trade-offs. And it's something that will be worth thinking about in the future standards. I don't know which way is the best way to do it at this point, or how would be the best way to proceed going forward. One thing that gets a particular call out is the downtown height plane. So height planes are they're an interesting creature. They were originally created in the early 1900s in New York City. The skyscraper was just coming into being, and they were building, 30-story buildings at 100% lot coverage, and people were like, oh my God, we're never going to see the sun again. And so their response to that was to, after a certain number of stories, to set an angle, and then anything above, or anything going in, above that, base level would have to taper back by, along that angle. And it created in New York what are called the wedding cake buildings, and some of them actually look really great. And but that worked. In that context, we were talking about, one of the densest places on Earth building up to 30 to 50 stories. And so the economics can be a little bit different lower. So these daylight planes give you the advantage of having a very low scale feel. If your goal is to have that a small village-like feel while you're in a mid-rise district, those two people standing here experience this as a two-story building. And I think that makes it desirable for someone who wants to really maintain that feel. The issue can be when you institute one of these, you've now lost all of the area that could have been built there is now forfeited, so that's the revenue that doesn't come in. And there's all your costs to build the building also go way up. The literal, the structure of how you build the building has to become more complicated when you build like this. Like literally how the weight is distributed around the building changes, which raises your costs and makes your plans more difficult to draft. All of your floor plans have to change floor to floor. How you do the infrastructure within the building has to change. And so it can make a building really significantly more expensive.
Isn't it also a concern for the earthquake-prone zones as well? Does this work well for them? Because, for instance, we are in that area. Doesn't it create a little bit of an imbalance with?
Well, it's nothing that can't be solved, but in the building code, if they're able to follow the building code, they will get to a good level of earthquake protection.
So it is earthquake retrofit then.
Yeah, anything that gets built, really anything that gets built that complies with the Washington Building Code should be able to take a 9. I mean, it's a pretty significant earthquake.
Yeah, the structural engineers take care of that, so you don't have that concern. But what he's describing about the cost of the building, now you have, as it stair steps in, you have more area that has finish on it, right? Where if it's just straight up like a box, now that's cheaper. And here now you're having to do a whole bunch of different construction methods to make it waterproof and just have more surface area to cover. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one of these in the front that it's throughout the downtown zone, and it's always at 45 degrees, and it starts at wherever the base height is. So in the downtown transition, that's 2 stories, and then stories 3 and 4 are subject to this. And then in the core, it starts at 35 feet. That's what's shown here, I think. It starts at 35 feet, and then the upper floors above that are subject to it. There's a second daylight plane, or there's a second height plane in our code, and it's specific to the downtown transition zone. So when you have anywhere in the downtown transition that has a single family zone adjacent to it, you have first a 20-foot setback, and then after that 20-foot setback, you have that 45-degree rise from the ground level this time, though, instead of from the building. And so if you have a lot that's relatively narrow here, the building could be essentially getting clipped on both edges. And with the way the parcels are here, I think that'd probably be pretty common, actually. But that's just one I wanted to talk about a little bit because daylight planes are really interesting things, but they also take a minute to explain. So, did I? Yeah, okay. So in 2021, we had a retail gap, or the city had a retail gap analysis, a company called the Retail Coach. The city got a grant, I believe, from the port, and they came in and conducted a retail gap analysis for existing retail spaces in the city. This wasn't about building new buildings or spaces. This is about what could go into the existing spaces now. And it was actually based off of people's cell phone data, tracking people's natural travel patterns. And they provided a list of businesses that were primarily fast casual restaurants, but IHG hotels and natural grocers also appeared. This went in line with, and I didn't talk about this one too much, but there was an there was a feasibility or something resembling a feasibility study in the 2000 plan that talked about what sort of things might be able to go in there. And a hotel and a spa and a health club also showed up in that earlier version because the golf course was nearby. And I should say that I think the pool of businesses that they had to pull from in their data were mostly chains. That's in part probably because of who this company's typical clients were, but it's easier to get data on chains than it is on mom and pops. So I wouldn't take the fact that these are chains here to necessarily mean that that's all that could go in here. But I would think that the businesses that could go in here would probably fall within similar categories. So maybe it's still a fast casual place, or it might have similar needs to one of these chains, even though it's not a chain itself.
Another aspect of that analysis that I recall is an estimate of how much space, commercial space, would be supported by the population density. So it wasn't just the density, it was a look at the density plus looking at the competing shopping centers in the area and looking at what people's habits are for where they go for certain things. And the analysis said that you can probably, given these circumstances, you could probably find businesses to fill X many thousand feet of commercial space. So it was a caution not to plan for, too much more than that. Otherwise, you're going to be planning for space that isn't going to have a demand for it.
Yeah, and I really need to find that part of the study. I haven't been able to locate it yet, but I know that it happened. But there's also a wider trend here of the amount of retail space that just is needed in general has been decreasing over time, and the places that have been hit the hardest are those power centers that everybody loved in the 90s. But these strip centers that we have here, especially your Class B, Class C strip centers, are not far behind. And so the environment is changing to less square footage overall, and more of that square footage needs to be towards active experiential uses.
If you go back can you go back one slide, please? When I look at a lot of those are places that have standalone buildings as well, which can be somewhat of a challenge given, our plot sizes and where things exist currently. So that's just another thing as I look at this list. Those are a lot of retailers that want it, like a Chick-fil-A, they want their own building and they need a whole bunch of space for the drive-throughs. And so I think it's interesting, this list is interesting because that's what is being shared out as, what they came up with versus a first floor multi-used facility where you have people walking in and using retail space versus, driving through.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're just educating us right now, but it's interesting to me as I just look at this list like all the rest of us. all the rest of us did. I really like Texas Roadhouse. And the thing I think about Newcastle is, and we've talked about this before, even in my short term on the commission, we're a small city, nestled between a lot of bigger cities like Bellevue and Seattle and even Renton. So the draw for people to come to Newcastle for shopping is pretty low. But as we considered something like, I mean, I think if we're eventually getting to something where we would be able to entice investors to build out something like the second story and the bridge and all that sort of thing, businesses like, and I know that, well, I think I know that it's not the city's job to entice businesses, but if you have something like a Texas Roadhouse in Newcastle, I think it's kind of like Safeway and QFC are right now. They draw people from other cities here to do business because of who they are. Like I know that I have friends all the way in Issaquah and Bellevue that come to this Safeway and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I don't know how that will ultimately ever play out in our planning, but it's kind of the notion that us drawing big buildings and big businesses here is going to be seemingly hard.
I think the other thing is when those particular retail chains are looking for a density. And that's where, as a smaller city, to what you were just describing, of having larger cities around us that have greater population density, that it'll be tough to get them here unless we do have more density.
And I think a great example would be Yea's Walk, where, I think Newcastle is famous for Yea's Walk. Nobody has that, and they come all the way here. So it's, I think, local chain stores versus like local mom and pop shops is probably the way to go.
Another thing I noticed is I was thinking this will be kind of a Newcastle customized list, but the Sprouts, do we actually have Sprouts in Seattle? I know there's one in California. I mean, I don't think we have here.
It's funny, I'm familiar with Sprouts from when I go to visit my family in Dallas, not from up here.
Yeah, I know. I'm from LA. We have one just in our neighborhood, but we have Trader Joe here. Trader Joe is not on the list. And I also, Queen has basically mixed use, like Trader Joe's, Trader Joe, and then on top of it, there are those apartment, those kind of.
And that is becoming more common in this region over time. I think that Safeway is determined to replace every store in its Seattle portfolio with one of those. So yeah, I mean that could be something that we try to leverage going forward, although that's a future conversation. So I just wanted to close out here with some broad takeaways from both of the plans. So there was some strengths and shared themes. There's a consistent desire for a walkable core and quality amenities. There was always a need for east-west connections and improvements on 132nd Place Southeast to connect the downtown area with the commons on a pedestrian scale and not just on the auto scale, which obviously we already have. And we did successfully concentrate our civic buildings and transit downtown. Although it was not in the way that the CBC plan originally envisioned, although the library is pretty close. And then for the structural challenges, I mean, the CBC plan really relied on expensive infrastructure to get things going, and when that was not forthcoming, there wasn't exactly a Plan B outcome that was baked into the plan. So you have the zoning standards and the design guidelines, and so you could go build something in, but without that leading infrastructure, it wasn't so obvious for a developer to come in and be like, why do I need to be here in particular? So having that like plan B, that stable foundation, is gonna be important in a future plan, I think. And on the other side, the downtown strategic plan might have restricted development to the point that nothing was viable. And I think that the proof point for that would probably be the mixed-use development behind the library that was trying to do I think a 5-story mixed-use condo building with a restaurant at the bottom that is fundamentally very typical across the region, and that was not possible to do under our code, and so they had to negotiate a development agreement with the city, which I think took 2 years, and by the time that was finished, the lending environment had changed, and now we don't know exactly what's going to happen there. So a development agreement is not a choice of first resort for a project like that. And so the fact that that's where they ended up going, I do think says a lot. So yeah, I spent a good amount of time researching this. It was there's a really interesting story here about people's different visions and desires and how they go about trying to get them. And I think because these two plans really kind of went about it in two different ways, these are two really good examples to keep in mind when we're thinking about those future standards, about how do you make something that you like what gets built and that it also gets built. And how do you make a plan that doesn't need to hit the moonshot to succeed. There's a lot of good lessons in here, I think, and there's some strategies and particulars from these plans about the way that people move around the spaces and the way that access and connectivity works. You see that showing up in multiple plans. It's probably because there's a good idea in there. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I have for this evening. And I'm not going to make any particular recommendations tonight. It's way, way, way premature for that. But that's just kind of my spiel on what I found.
Okay, what other questions do you have for Tyler?
I was just going to say, this is very, very helpful to have this history and the comparison, and you put it together in a way for us to easily understand it. So thank you.
I don't know if you can answer this for me, so because I was just reading through what you guys had put out on the agenda. In 2000, do you know if we had a consultant for that Lake Bourne corridor plan back then?
Yes, so Makers handled the whole plan. So all 3 sectors were developed under Makers.
Okay, and do you know how much it cost the city back then?
I don't, but I also know that the number wouldn't make a whole lot of sense today, so it's,
Okay.
yeah.
And how did they pay for those costs? Was it through a grant or?
I'm not sure because they may have paid for it out of their own taxes. I think and I'm guessing here, but I think what may be more likely was that they got a grant from the state.
Okay.
But I don't know that.
Okay, well, that's fine.
No other questions for Tyler? Okay, I'd like to expand a little bit on Director Fitzgibbon's comments about the conversations that we've been having with Vice Chair Troutman and Commissioner Beeson and Tyler and Aaron, and put it in context of the last 6 months of interest in the downtown plan. So we start as a commission, we started not looking at the downtown plan, but we were interested in design standards. That was the thing that emerged at an earlier commission. I think Jim Quigg was the one who was really advocating for that, and it sort of stayed on our radar. And we were initially planning to take a look at the downtown design standards. Tyler took a crack at doing some fixes that would bring them into compliance with state law, but there was more that needed to be done and needed to be done more thoughtfully. So that was what we saw as our role then. Since then, there was a new council that was elected, and the council has greater interest in the downtown plan. And they have been giving us direction through Aaron about what they would like to see happen. And so the conversations that we've been having as sort of an informal subcommittee, I guess, but is to just think through what might make sense for the city to do to respond to the council's interest in making things happen, to make something happen downtown. I think underlying their interest is that they would like to see not just a plan on paper like this, they'd like to see some redevelopment that brings in additional businesses, that brings in more tax revenue, that brings in more opportunities. So we've been given some thought to that. And the council has also said, we think it would make sense to have some kind of advisory committee. And so we've been thinking about, well, how would that committee function, and what kind of representation should be there in order for it to really give the council advice that would help them know what the community wants. The council has also said, well, we ought to do some sensing to find out what the community wants now, because the community views change over time. What did they want for the downtown? So that's another piece that we've been talking about. And then maybe the last piece that we've been talking about is to really take an objective look from someone who has expertise about what could be developed downtown. What is something, instead of starting with a pie in the sky plan like we had in 2000, what is something that would be commercially feasible down there? What would developers be willing to spend money on to create down there? And along with maybe an updated list of what kind of businesses could go in there, so that so we'd have a practical idea of what's feasible. So so far it's just been a lot of conversation about those things, with the idea toward making, having further conversations with the council about, here's a way we could approach it. What do you think? But I think having another study done about what is actually doable in practical, a reality check, so to speak, about what could happen down there would be really useful to have before we start asking people, the citizens, what do you want down there? Because what they want may not be feasible, and it'd be good for us to be able to say, well, we'd like that too, but I don't think that would ever get built. So, Aaron, do you want to add anything?
Could I?
Only that all this is, I haven't had any direct conversations with council members or the city manager yet on what we're proposing or to get their thoughts or feedback yet. So these are all just thoughts right now.
And I'll just say one more thing, and I'll go to you, Stu. I think that when the time for this to come before the commission formally would be when there is a proposal for a change in the city ordinance. That's our charter, is to review changes in the city ordinance. These other things are really more in the purview of staff. The things that I just described, those are really more staff purview, and I'm happy that staff has included members of the commission to give input to that. But this will all come back to us at some point when there is a need for a recommendation from the commission. Commissioner Blocker.
I think one of the points that I took away from what Tyler just gave us was the pie in the sky plan that we saw that was envisioned a quarter of a century ago. It necessarily relied a lot on what the landowners wanted to do. before anything could really change or be developed or changed in a meaningful way. So I think along with the notion of, another study committee or a contract going out, investigating everything, it almost seems like one of the main things is starting with landowners in the downtown core. Do they have any interest in redesigning the city or being part of the redesign of the city and that whole thing? I mean, because to me, the landowner's got to be willing before anything really happens.
That's a good point, and I'm particularly reminded of the fact that the primary road off of Coal Creek into the Commons is a private road owned by the Hanson Moving Company. And at some point or another, they'll have to have some sort of negotiations with the landowner. You always hear horror stories about eminent domain and things of that nature, and it's those things can be avoided if the landowners and the other stakeholders are brought in early in the process. And and it could be the landowners, and we talked about this a little bit this morning, but HOA people and a lot of different stakeholders need to be involved relatively early, but not until we know what's feasible, so that, we're grounded in reality at least.
Okay, I think we have covered this topic. My compliments to you, Tyler, for taking a lot of information and making it digestible and understandable. Thank you very much. We don't have any public in our audience, so we won't have any additional public comment, and we can turn to the planning calendar. Director Fitzgibbons, you want to comment on the calendar?
Yeah, happy to. So I believe Chair Gatzek mentioned this earlier, but the Planning Commission vacancy deadline for applications is next Wednesday, the 31st. So there's a chance we could have a new commissioner by the next meeting, just depending on how that goes, hopefully. And so then at the next meeting, we'll have the nonconformance code update and the sign code hearing, and possibly, I don't know, Planner Coyle, if we've talked with Mr. Kenny yet or not about potentially having him at the next meeting to talk about small cells. And maybe we can send him some of these questions that we had tonight. I wrote them all down early, so. And then in May, we could potentially have the hearing for small cells, and then we need to get rolling on our climate element. We have about 3 years until it's due, and we have a lot of work ahead of us, so that's where we are for the next couple of months. I know the summer vacations are also coming up, so Chair Gatzek has already let me know that on the meeting in June, he won't be here. I just want to make sure that we have a quorum at our meetings this summer, so if you want to take a look at your calendars and let me know if you're going to be out for any of the meetings that you know of at this time in the future, just to make sure we'll have quorums at those meetings. And I know in the past too, we've also rearranged our meetings for the summer events. So if we need to do that, also we can talk about that maybe in May or when we get a little closer. So, any questions about upcoming items or things that anybody's thought about that we should be talking about?
I do have a quick question. Excuse me. Go ahead. What, if anything, does the commission have to do with the town hall meeting that's coming up? In the past, we've had a table at some of them. Is that something that we want to address sooner rather than later?
It's a good question. We could definitely have a table. I think we've used it for outreach in the past. I think it's a little soon for any kind of outreach I can think of. Or change, we've also had like flyers for changes to code at these meetings. But
Do you know the date of that meeting?
the 5th,
Tuesday, the 5th
Of
of May.
yeah.
of May. Well, I think I like us having a table there, and then commissioners who want to be there can be there. It's a great time just to see what people are interested in asking. There's generally not a lot of interest, but people do come up and ask questions, and so I would like for there to be a planning commission table.
Okay, I'll let Amy know. Anybody has any ideas about, sometimes our table seems a little bit bare. So about anything about, we could have a zoning map there, or just anything that might be useful to talk to. If you have thoughts right now, I'm happy to take them, or, in April's meeting, if you have suggestions then, any time between them. You can email
Last
me.
year, we had just gone through changing the zoning, and so we had what the existing zoning was and what the proposed new changes were. And I got quite a few people that were, invested parties that were pretty interested in that sort of thing. But yeah, I agree, you got to have some goodies for them to draw them in.
Yeah,
We could have a sheet that has a layman's version of what we're working on this year. And I'd be happy to work with you on that, Aaron, just some topics and a real simple description of what's entailed.
cool. We could have a little box that people could put little notes in if they have ideas but don't want us to talk about them at the meeting. Not a complaint box, we won't call it that, an idea box. Okay. Well, if you do have ideas, feel free to send them to me, and also you can, of course, CC Charlie and Len on those too.
I was just gonna say, Erin, if you have a box, then how do we get back to those people, or what do we do with the comments? Because sometimes it's better not to get them unless you have a way to respond.
That's true. Yeah, if we got a lot of comments, that would be a lot of responses. That's a good point.
It reminds me, some of us have little official badges that say our name and planning commission. And anybody who wants one can get one. So if you don't have one and you'd like one, let Aaron know. And
You don't have a name tag? Oh, okay, yeah, we'll get you one. Those come really fast. Anybody else?
Commissioner Blocker.
I have 3 items. One, and 2 of them are more related to what we've already done with the comp plan update. But during that process, we talked about the 2 city parcels, one down by the retirement home and one down by across from May Creek Parkway. And the possibility of Habitat for Humanity having an interest ever in building on those. And I think Director Fitzgibbons was going to ask something about that, but I never heard anything back.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's a good question. So I met the city manager and I had a preliminary meeting with Arch, and then I've been going back and forth with Arch, basically to look at those 3 parcels that we talked about, the one by Regency, the one by Boring Creek, and the one to the east of our stormwater ponds. And of course, our stream buffers just increased. And so the one off of Boring Creek might no longer be something that an affordable housing developer would be interested in, depending on the depth of that. The one next to Regency is difficult because of its, because there's actually a dam, it's technically a dam that's right next to Regency. And then the only entry to it is off of Coal Creek Parkway, which could make circulation really difficult and or dangerous, especially with how close it is to Newcastle Way there. So it's sounding like that one's maybe not, although we do need a downtown park. So that might be a good spot for a future downtown, small downtown passive kind of recreational park. We'll see.
Maybe a dog park.
Maybe a dog park. There you go. Let everybody in the stormwater pond. But then the one that is possibly interesting is the one that we were talking about rezoning to R6. And then we looked back at those old aerials and we're like, oh. And what's interesting, it's the very east end of it that would be interesting, possibly. I haven't received the official report from Max over at Arch. I have been poking him to try to get it, but yeah, so thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you. The other one, I was curious if we were going to hear anything probably fairly soon, maybe not right now, but fairly soon, about some of the things that the legislature has passed this year in regarding to housing. And I don't know, some of the things that they envision going into every neighborhood in the state. I'd be interested in hearing about what that's going to do to our comp plan review in our neighborhoods in the city. And then the third item I had was, I think at the last Planning Commission meeting, Chairman Gadzik made a suggestion. I thought it was a pretty good suggestion, actually. We didn't talk about it at all, but he thought that we have a pretty classy looking bridge at the south end of the city, and that we ought to have some signage there to brag about driving into Newcastle coming north. And as I thought about that a little bit, I thought, you know, in the day and age we're in, I think it might be fitting if we considered a proposal to the council that perhaps along with doing some sort of an entering the city sign there at the bridge, that we actually named the bridge, the memorial bridge for Richard Herzog, the officer who was killed in service to the city. So I'd actually like to consider, maybe the commission could make that a suggestion or a proposal.
I think a community member could make that a proposal. The CAC actually does the naming for parks. I wonder if that would also follow.
I'm a
under
committee
their
member.
purview.
I'm a community person.
Yes, yes, any community member, yes. So that could also be a suggestion for the CAC that they might have under their purview.
You know, I actually sketched up after Chair Gadzik mentioned that, you know, we should have some way to let people know, hey, you're in Newcastle now. And I don't know if you've seen, Reno has a thing that goes across that says the greatest little city in the States. And I actually sketched up, you know how the arches are on either side. You can make something that mimicked those arches that could go across. Now, I don't know what I mean, there's obviously clearance standards and things like that, but I don't know what the feasibility of doing something like that was. But the way I drew it up, it looked kind of cool.
It's also the structure.
Tyler, did the EDC talk at all, or the Economic Development Committee, did they talk at all the locations of the wayfinding signs that they're talking about. Is there one down by the bridge?
They did, and I think the location, they were looking at putting one of those signs at near the southern entrance to the city. I think the location that they're leaning towards at the moment, because it's not settled just yet, but I think it was at just north of where May Valley Road meets Coal Creek, because that is kind of the back door from Newcastle, and so they thought if they put it there that they could catch, both people or both groups. I would say that the kind of signs that they're looking at are more wayfinding signs. They're somewhat monumental, but not to the same extent that Len was just talking about, or that, yeah.
Right,
So.
right. The downtown strategic plan does have those.
Yeah, and
Study, but
those
yeah.
signs would or those, big bold monuments would also be different from what the Economic Development Committee is working on now. It's more of like, welcome to Newcastle, our shops are over there, would be the fundamental goal of them.
Right.
But they are actually open to doing larger signs as well. It would just be in a separate effort.
Gotcha. Well, I can work with Chair Gatzek to but we could put together a legislature update. We're just starting to get them through the American Planning Association, the Washington chapter. And they're actually doing a happy hour kind of presentation, if you're interested, at the Seattle Library. I think it's next Wednesday evening. I can't make it, but if you are interested, I'm happy to share out that flyer if you'd like to go. You go hang out with a bunch of planning folks. So, good times. But anyway, yeah, we could work on putting something together. So.
Okay, if there are no more comments, we will declare this meeting adjourned.